McLaren took a big gamble, dumping Daniel Ricciardo to controversially sign rookie Oscar Piastri as his Formula 1 replacement. Now it's more convinced than ever that Piastri is on a path to becoming one of F1's best drivers. Before the rookie had even started a Grand Prix, McLaren wasn't afraid to zero in on specific characteristics and extrapolate that into major potential for Piastri. It's fair to say not everybody bought into that, especially if they were Ricciardo fans. And Piastri's early headline results haven't exactly been earth-shattering. But the underlying evidence is more convincing and points to Piastri doing things that Ricciardo couldn't and giving McLaren what has previously been missing. McLaren team principal Andrea Stella said Piastri had traits that were the definition of talent back in Bahrain ahead of Piastri's rookie weekend, and expressed his conviction that Piastri will eventually be one of the best drivers on the grid. 3 races hardly make for the required sample set to start drawing definitive conclusions about that either way, but it's a useful early signpost for whether Piastri is progressing in that direction. The results are hardly remarkable, with 2 ill-fated races cancelled out by a fortunate boost into the points in Australia, but several elements have left McLaren massively encouraged. For one thing, Piastri's relative performance to Norris is already looking better than when Ricciardo was driving. Ricciardo found it difficult to adapt to the needs of the 2 McLarens he drove, was comprehensively beaten by Norris with an average qualifying deficit of around 0.3 of a second last year, and agreed to an early exit 1 year before the end of his 3-year deal. As Ricciardo's struggles continued, McLaren swooped to sign Piastri from rival Alpine as a replacement. In Piastri's first 3 qualifying sessions with McLaren, he has made small mistakes in Bahrain and Australia that exaggerated his deficits at those tracks, but he also out-qualified Norris in Saudi Arabia. That was a feat Ricciardo only managed once across the whole of 2022 in representative head-to-heads, and although in Piastri's case he was aided by Norris hitting the wall in Q1, he was the quicker driver overall in Jeddah. There's even a suggestion that Piastri's sheer pace contributed to that rare error from Norris. Piastri was then just over 1/4 of a second slower than Norris in Melbourne qualifying after a slight misjudgment at turn 11 that cost him the majority of his deficit. At worst, Piastri is at least already at Ricciardo's level and is obviously only at the start of his development curve. In general, McLaren feels that Piastri is close to Norris in most types of corners and is also providing references to Norris himself. Norris, meanwhile, has said that Piastri is keeping me on my toes at a time both drivers are having to deal with a slightly difficult MCL60 that is awaiting significant upgrades. McLaren's not directly criticised Ricciardo and has no intention to, but Stella did come very close with his comment that the closeness in performance between Piastri and Norris is certainly much better than we saw last year. It's inevitable that specific areas of praise for Piastri will also be a comparison with what came before. For example, in what seems like another indirect reference to Ricciardo, Norris said regarding Piastri that our comments are probably a little bit more in line than what they have been in previous years. And McLaren has made a point of stressing that Piastri's technical knowledge is excellent, and his very precise feel for the car's behaviour means he's already exhibiting Norris levels of feedback and understanding. That is aiding McLaren's development effort and has left the team feeling like it doesn't actually have a rookie in the car, which brings to mind the cliched mature beyond his years praise for such a young driver. So how is Piastri achieving this, and is there actually that much of a difference between what he can do and what Ricciardo couldn't? Piastri talked early in the year about needing to adjust his driving style to the McLaren, and after 3 qualifying sessions, his approach appears encouragingly close to Norris in key areas like braking technique, something Ricciardo was particularly weak at relative to Norris. There's been no obvious weakness over the first 3 tracks of the season. At worst, Piastri tends to bleed a little bit of lap time, we're talking a matter of hundredths of a second per corner over an entire lap. But even then, there will be some parts of the lap he is faster. Getting to this level would not be possible without an excellent grasp of more than just the fundamentals. While every F1 driver clearly understands the basics of driving well, sensitivity of feeling behind the wheel is something that varies from person to person. The range of talents and attributes from drivers, especially rookies, varies immensely. Piastri is not perfect and is far from the finished article, but his technical ability is clearly a major strength and influences everything else he does. He's already shown impressive comprehension of the car's behaviour, which allows him to identify cause and effect while driving. This is linked to Stella's favourite trait, that Piastri doesn't always need to wait to get back to the garage to see the data or to be told where to improve. He says Piastri has a quite outstanding ability to process in the car where he can find time lap to lap or run to run. That's something McLaren has seen for a long time already. It goes back beyond pre-season testing, beyond even the Abu Dhabi test last year, or the 2021 car running that was Piastri's first in-car experience with McLaren. It was apparent on his very first day in the simulator. It's impossible not to draw another parallel with Ricciardo at this point. One of Ricciardo's biggest struggles was just not grasping what the car was doing or why. He talked openly about this. Either he couldn't do what Norris was doing, or he did it and didn't understand how. There was a fundamental disconnect there. Piastri is not suffering the same problem. That manifests itself in a closer performance profile than Norris versus Ricciardo, but unsurprisingly goes deeper, with the team's data revealing a similarity in technique and execution that was rarely seen in the last 2 years. And where there are gaps that need further scrutiny, and there are because it's not like Piastri is always on Norris's level, the other thing that's different is that Piastri can translate that into a clear step on his next run. He has enough control of the situation to, as Stella puts it, cash in on these opportunities. There are fluctuations weekend to weekend, like the small mistakes he made in Bahrain and Australia qualifying, but overall, the improvement curve is on a positive trend. Inevitably, given the contentious backstory to his switch from Alpine, there were a few sneers when McLaren started the season poorly and Alpine was far more competitive. But Piastri can do nothing about the quality of car he has. What matters more is whether he's getting the most out of it and getting good results where possible. The obvious highlights are breaking his point stuck with an assured drive to 8th in Australia and showing serious pace at times, especially the peak in Saudi Arabia qualifying. Unsurprisingly though, there are areas to improve. Piastri must start evening out his qualifying performances and piece together things more consistently to deliver on the obvious potential of the first few weekends. Norris is generally doing a better job at the moment of wrestling a downforce light car on the limit, and Piastri tends to recognise that his performances have been driver limited rather than car limited. In Bahrain, a snap through turn 2 exaggerated Piastri's deficit to Norris, but even there he ended the lap quicker in the medium and high speed final sector. And in Australia, where the track surface is less forgiving of cars that lack grip or drivers that get slightly optimistic, a minor braking misjudgment at turn 11 was the difference. Harshly, there is a small trend of underachievement in qualifying, although this might be considered fairly typical for a rookie. The races have also been a mixed bag, although not exactly through Piastri's doing. In Bahrain, he was eliminated early on by an electrical problem, then his Jeddah race was ruined after starting 9th when light contact with Pierre Gasly's Alpine exiting the second corner led to wing damage that amazingly also ruined Norris's race because he was hit by the debris. Piastri didn't cause that clash as it was Gasly who squeezed him, but what was most encouraging was that Piastri recognised he could have put himself in a less risky position. In Australia, Piastri also recognised immediately after the race that he'd spent too long behind Yuki Tsunoda's AlphaTauri and should have got past more incisively. Once in clear air, he didn't have the same pace as Norris, at least on a consistent enough basis. Keeping his nose clean and being rewarded with the first point scoring result of his F1 career as various cars dropped out in the late chaos could maybe be considered a reward for the tribulations of his first 2 races. We can tentatively conclude that Piastri has built a very good platform to progress from. There are clear signs he can do things that Ricciardo couldn't, he's keeping Norris on his toes, and the high points speak for themselves. What matters most to McLaren is the trend of improvement since it first started working with Piastri last year, and the group of core skills he has that has facilitated this, including his attitude. Identifying areas to improve, then improving them, has been the hallmark of Piastri's rise to F1 in the first place, so it's no surprise to see the same trait underpinning his early promise. It also bodes well for when or if McLaren finally starts to rectify the weaknesses of the MCL60 and makes it more competitive. McLaren is absolutely convinced Piastri will be able to match the car's improvement and push Norris for bigger and better results when it has a higher peak. There's no way to be sure, but the early body of evidence is at least in Piastri's favour.